Right. So, last week I talked about the disappearance of archers from Dark Age warfare, and this week I thought I would expand on that and talk about what happened now that archers seem to have largely disappeared from fighting. And first off, the archers weren't totally gone. We have records of archers appearing in all sorts of contexts. The Irish certainly started adopting bows as a much larger piece of warfare during this time, especially the Kingdom of Dalradia became sort of known for a large force of archers. So the archers were still there, but they still weren't quite as the same. They weren't, large blocks firing off huge volleys to rain down on enemy formations. Instead, I think it was more likely became a skirmisher type role. So, sort of how we see in later medieval Irish sources about how archers would just sort of be thrown in with the rest of the kerns, along with, javelins and whatever else the kerns were using. They weren't a block of archers in the same way that the Roman archers or the Norman archers were. So I think that probably became the role of archers. They became skirmishers, uh, where they would, at the start of the battle, go up towards enemy formations and start shooting off at them, or even during a battle, assuming it's a professional archer, if you will. Somebody who only fought with the bow, who didn't fight in the melee, could possibly stay by the flanks of the army to try to get shots off uh, towards the unprotected sides of the enemy formation. So that's how archers were acting, at least in battlefield situations. That's also how most ranged weapons seem to have started to be used in this time period. You started to see javelins become very important, or remained very important, I guess we should say. And certainly in, like, Ygodothin, they mention javelins a lot, and many Norse sagas talk about javelins being thrown before battle. And of course, you still have, like Irish darts. Slings and sling staffs seem to remain used fairly widely throughout all of the Dark Ages and even into the Middle Ages. So you start seeing ranged weapons become sort of smaller skirmish formations. You might see men, run up and skirmish before a battle, or more likely these would be the frontline warriors would also have javelins, and they would hurl those at the enemy before the actual formations clashed. And you see the same thing in certainly Irish sagas. Like Cuchulainn uses his sling a lot. He, will circle the enemy firing a sling before actually charging in on his chariot. And so you certainly see these ranged weapons stop being sort of missile weapons in the way we would think of them. They aren't people standing firing volleys at people. They become skirmishing roles and soften up the enemy. Melee certainly is the largest factor of the time due to partially its scale. But so when do missile weapons really become important? And they really become important in sieges. Because in a siege, you don't have just the professional warriors fighting anymore. Instead, you see, the town or the city or the fortress. Everyone has to be part of that siege effort. If it was just the household guard of, the lord of that castle, they would fall very quickly. So the peasants would have to then join in the siege because, there's really nothing else to do. They sort of have to fight once their homes are under siege. And that's when I think ranged weapons certainly would have played a much larger role. Because the peasants would have had relative skill with ranged weapons. They might not have been trained soldiers, and they probably didn't know how to, fight in formation or anything. But, they would certainly know how to hunt. So They might hunt with javelins, they might hunt with bows. Slings, again, remained very important, especially for the lower class. So you still see a lot of ranged weapons being used. It's just not used by soldiers. And these peasants don't seem to have started really going on campaign until later into the Middle Ages. So during, the Dark Ages, up until Viking times, when you still have mainly small retinues of warriors rather than, billeting troops, is when you really start to see peasants fighting is really only in sieges. Because, you wouldn't drag your farmers off away from their fields to go out on campaign. But when they're already under siege, you might force them to use their hunting bows, to use their slings, or just, to throw rocks and stuff down from the walls of your fortifications onto the enemy. And that's sort of how ranged weapon, or at least how I think ranged weapons would have been used. There would have been skirmishing in battlefield situations, and there would have been a much larger role for the defending force of a siege. The offensive force of a siege might not use them as much because, again, you would have to bring a bunch of new people to sort of sit around the enemy fortress in a way that the defending side wouldn't have to. Thanks for watching.